to week 4. This is really the pivotal week in this course with Nietzsche, central text. I think I could fairly say our most difficult text, you'd be pleased to hear. If you haven't found it difficult, you must have been dreaming for the last week. My only ambition today is to try and make this argument clear. It's not a systematic argument, so we'll try and get as clear as possible what he's actually arguing through what you've been reading. Just before we begin, examples of Greek tragedy. Those of you, probably most of you, not familiar with classical Greek tragedy. My suggestion for those of you who want to actually read the tragedies, there are three writers. There's Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. The work of Aeschylus, I'd suggest, I think it's by far his most powerful, is Agamemnon, not the Prometheus that Nietzsche refers to. And if you're going to read that, you have to read it in English and Latin, which is Latin translation. He's also the great translator in Homer's video. I mentioned weeks ago. Sophocles, most influential, most powerful play. Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex, different titles. Translation doesn't matter so much in reading it. In the 19th century, his play Antigone was the most influential. You may know that. Antigone. It's part of the same story that Antigone was the daughter of Oedipus. And Euripides, a lot of plays have survived. The one I'd recommend is Iphigenia, Iphigenia in Alice. It's a powerful tragedy. Nietzsche, you will pick up, is rather hostile to Euripides, probably largely with good reason, but his argument doesn't really fit this particular play. Best known Euripides plays are probably Medea, who kills her own children. Bacchae, very Dionysian, to use today's categories, and a lot of others. Right, we're looking at a very different concept of culture than Socrates, one that we looked at in detail 2 weeks ago. We've sort of got a cultural war which Nietzsche sets up, and for Nietzsche, Socrates is the enemy. And the Socrates he represents is very much the Socrates we looked at 2 weeks ago. The contrasting notion of culture could be summed up in this formula or equation. Mythos is pathos. It's a sort of early tragedy, Homeric Greek view. Let me just talk a little bit about that. Pathos, English word, derives from the classical Greek verb paskein. Pasco, The classical Greek verb's got a couple of very important meanings built into it. Passion is one. We get the English word passion from pathos. Strong feeling, emotion, driving emotion, passion. Paskein is the root of modern English passion. Paskein also means to experience. It's a general concept of, if you want to experience life, to experience, to live. Paskein. But at the same time, it also means to suffer. English word pathos probably taps in more to the suffering dimension of Pascal. There's sort of as I did with the word for truth a few weeks ago, there's a sort of philosophy then built into this classical Greek word, which goes something like, if you want to live, you want to experience things, live your life. Most of us would hold to, it's important, unless you really want to withdraw into a monastery or a nunnery and cut yourself off from life or become a Buddhist monk. It's probably doesn't pertain to anyone in this room. It's a very, very, very small minority. If you want to live to the full, live your life, seize the day. We've got lots of philosophies that trumpet this, have a full life, with a lot of experience, then Pascal, not Pascal. But the Greek formula is that essential to that is that you will suffer. Suffering and experience go hand in hand, or inescapably linked. However much we humans want to be happy, escape suffering, which of course we all do, escape pain. If you want to live, you want to experience, a deep and inevitable part of that is suffering. And English derivatives from pathos, of course, we get pathology, sickness. Apathy, it's closer to the Greek. Apathy, indifference, no energy. Someone who's apathetic, got no passion, basically. A in front, classical Greek means no, a negation. So without passion, apathy. Very closely linked to sort of classical Greek meaning of this verb. You think of other English?
Pathetic.
Pathetic, yes, pathetic word. It actually originally means full of pathos, sort of suffering, but it's sort of turned into this sort of derisory, hasn't it? But no, something's pathetic, apart from just the slang usage, but it's unadmirable, or feeble, or weak, maybe in the apathy tradition. Any others?
To expand, I guess, on the suffering would be a pathogen.
A pathogen? Yeah, sort of disease. It's sort of, as in pathology, a pathogen, things that have seeped into medical language. Actually, all our medical terminology, by the way, comes from classical Greek.
How about empathy?
Empathy. Definitely. Sort of feeling with, with, passion with, sympathy. Another one, sympathy. Again, a with prefix. All of this drawing on the pathos terminology, passion with, feeling with, feeling. Well, the cultural formula is that if you want pathos, if pathos is going to be bearable, sustainable, and driving, this is pretty much Nietzsche's thesis, pretty close to home. You need myth. Without myth, and the German Nietzsche uses mythos, I'm sort of a bit avoiding the proper English word myth, because it's got too much association. It's just a myth. It's not true. It's fictitious and not worth taking seriously. Whereas in what we're talking about today, the rest of this course, mythos, is myth that's much more powerful and is all important. And whether the stories actually happened or not is a bit beside the point. So mythos is, and again, talked about this in the first couple of weeks, this sort of archetypal, the big stories in the beginning. The archetypes of a culture, and those of you who studied Jung, it's not really using it in Jung, the word archetype in Jung's sense. This is really much more about archetypal stories. And for Nietzsche, they come from Greek tragedy. And they are what make the experience and the suffering viable, bearable, endurable. And we'll be looking at what happens when the mythos dies or becomes too weak. That's a very different concept of culture from Socrates. And Socrates is much more a moral, ethical concept. A meaningful life is one in which you're a good person, you behave ethically, you do good things and avoid harming others. It's the Socrates concept. This has got nothing to do with that whatsoever. The good life is about experience, suffering, and for that to be possible, you need a powerful and engaging mythos. And that's what culture is, the mythos. So that's our, now the rest of the morning will be clarifying in more detail what Nietzsche's trying to get at with all of this. And a fair bit of this text is obscure and difficult, and especially for those of you who are not familiar with classical Greek gods and whatever else. In the classical Greek culture, just before we turn to Nietzsche himself, the Greeks believed in gods and goddesses, powerful supernatural beings or entities. There were quite a few of them. There are major ones and minor ones. The major ones live on Olympus. You've probably, from children's fairy tales and other stuff, got some inkling of all of this. Zeus, the king of the gods. One of the odd things about the Greek gods and goddesses is that classical Greek culture was very patriarchal. Women were hardly allowed out in public. And yet, amongst the gods and goddesses, it tends to be the goddesses who get their way. Amongst the supernatural figures, the goddesses are probably, certainly in Homer, in the Iliad, it's the goddess of wisdom, Athena, Zeus's wife, Hera, who really get their way over the male gods. This is sort of one of the... Also classical Athens, 5th century Athens, very patriarchal society. If you went up on the Acropolis where the Parthenon is and you looked at the statues, almost all women. Virtually no male statues. I can't think of any. Predominantly the goddess Athena, the patron goddess of the city of Athens. But there's this rather striking sort of duality in classical Greek culture. The Greeks didn't only believe in gods and goddesses. Even more powerful was the force of what's sometimes called necessity. Okay. Even more powerful than the gods and goddesses and the force of necessity, what has to be an anchor. A-N-A-G-K-E. Also female, by the way. The force that's even more powerful than the gods is also female. Ananke, necessity, has 3 daughters, the Fates. The Greek word for, yeah. The Greek word for fate, fates, Moira. Have we got any Moiras in this class?
I think that's one over there.
Pardon?
I think that's one over there.
A Moira.
Oh, sorry.
No Moiras, there are subjects here. I wouldn't advise you to name your daughters Moira. in the Greek tradition. Very powerful. But the daughters, 3 daughters of necessity, the 3 fates, sometimes regarded as 3 beautiful women, sometimes 3 old hags. Varies, predominantly 3 in the Greek case, 3 beautiful women. There's Cain of Goya, some of you may know of the fates. There's 3 witches or hags. The 3 witches in Macbeth, Shakespeare, are sort of like the fates. Fates. And the Greek view it's a very fatalistic view. Life is fated. And the god Apollo, who we've been talking about quite a bit today, even he said he has very little power compared to the fates, fate, necessity. The fates, or fate, is actually differentiated in two between the moirai and Keres, K-E-R-E-S. You might translate in English as the dooms. There's the moirai actually write the script of your life. Yeah.
I was thinking.
You're just thinking?
Yeah.
It's actually a good way to think, sticking your finger up. There's a couple of you doing it. We've all got strange behaviour when we think. The fates, the moirai, write the script that determines the course of your life, and the keres, or the dooms, make sure that it comes about, that it's enforced. I mean, the most powerful figure in Greek tragedy of this, of course, is Oedipus, who is a very powerful, confident individual, wise, intelligent, the best of all, regardless the most supreme of all men. But without knowing it, he marries his mother, kills his father, marries his mother, has 4 children with his mother, and then fate catches up with him. So he learns very, very harshly the power of fate or destiny, whatever you might call it. So this is sort of context for mythos. Socrates, one of the aspects of Socratic or Socrates philosophy is belief in freedom, the opposite of fate. We're free to change ourselves, we're free to make ourselves. The mythos fated view is you're dreaming, you kill yourself. So this is some of the territory that we're sort of traversing here. Is that reasonably clear? One of the things Nietzsche throws in, quite a number of perplexing things, is that the line that wisdom is a crime against nature. Wisdom is a crime against nature. Anyone make any sense of this?
Does it mean that rationality happens after the fact, and it's just us trying to account for something that's already there?
Rationality happens after the fact. I think it's more pungent than that. I mean, he links it with Oedipus, and it almost suggests that Oedipus is the man of wisdom, the man amongst humans who is most intelligent, most insightful, most wise. The reason is that he's committed incest and father murder. So it's actually crime, in his case, that's linked with knowledge, wisdom. Now, this is completely at odds with modern Western assumptions, I think, isn't it? Nature is, the more you go into this text, and the clearer it becomes, and it will slowly become clearer, not completely clear. There's too many contradictions and difficulties in it. But the clearer it becomes, which is as good as it's going to get in this text, the more you'll see that he's really challenging the for Nietzsche, Socrates is the great cultural revolutionary in Western history. He changed culture from mythos to a much more optimistic belief in happiness, freedom, and being good people. And Nietzsche at almost every turn is challenging that. He's saying, if you believe that, you're dreaming. You've actually worse than that. You've cut yourself off from the deepest passions and feelings and the things that actually make life worth living. You've sort of moved into a state of denial of reality. That's what this text, at the core of this text, is this cultural war, struggle, battle going on against Socrates and what Nietzsche sees Socrates representing. And wisdom is a crime against nature. I mean, we close down all the universities if we believe that 100%.
So Socrates is denying the existence of pathos?
No, Socrates doesn't deny suffering, but Socrates basically says
Sorry, mythos.
of mythos.
Yeah.
For Socrates, Nietzsche's line, or one of Nietzsche's lines on this is mythos is for people who are not very bright. It's a bit primitive, a bit backward.
Who can't think for
Or
themselves.
can't think, yes. Yeah. So, it's for children and for primitives and for, for people who are not too bright. But, we sort of confident, free, emancipated individuals, we don't need mythos.
Otherwise, all of that concept of self-evaluation would be obsolete. Because if you just believe that, whatever is going to be, then you're not seeking out the truth about yourself. You're not seeking out that evaluation. Thus, everything that he ever said would be devalued.
I think the mythos view is that that's too rational. That, life is riddled with contradictions. That on the one hand, everything is fated, and therefore, if you're rational, why not just eat, drink, and shrug my shoulders? But the reality is that people under the power of fate, or at least the heroes under the power of fate, don't live like that at all. They struggle, they strive, they rebel, they try and understand, they try and act. We'll come to Nietzsche's reading of Hamlet a bit later.
When he said that wisdom is a crime of nature, was he trying to say that that intellect, that wisdom, is actually a disservice that we have because we don't have control over our fate? That what Socrates would say is our intellect to make decisions to control our lives. He's sort of saying, well, that doesn't work because fate controls our lives. And so it's almost a disservice that we have to experience this feeling that we have that intellect or that control. So I don't think
I think that's part of it. Perhaps it starts more with the sense that we're animals.
Yeah.
We'll come to this when we start talking about the Dionysian. That we're animals, and as a result we move in nature. And that actually, when he uses Heraclitus, the first of Greek philosophers, the individual is a crime against nature. Very interesting philosopher. The individual is a crime, because in the animal world, at least in Nietzsche's perception of it here, there aren't individuals in our sense. We pride ourselves on being individuals, having character, being interesting, being different from each other, being original, all that sort of stuff. This is in this equation here that very feeling is a crime against nature, that we humans have rebelled against nature, and there are huge costs to that.
In the explaining chapter, they talk about how like Germany at the time, was it Germany?
Yeah.
Yeah, at the time was experiencing something awful. Is this what they're talking about?
No, that's just silly. This is a timeless theory of culture. The secondary literature on Nietzsche is like secondary literature on Marx. It's actually not very good. So stick to the text.
Okay. I kept trying to decipher all that.
No, yeah, of course, as we do. I just leave that bit hanging. There's an interesting reading of Oedipus, though, that Oedipus is, usually the assumption is Oedipus is pursuing knowledge, and it's his ignorance about himself that leads him to killing his father without knowing it's his father, marrying his mother without knowing it's his mother, horror, and having 4 children with his mother. The usual assumption is he's intelligent, insightful, but he doesn't see the most important thing about himself. Nietzsche's saying, no. His insight, his wisdom and all of that goes hand in hand with these massive crimes of parasite killing, father killing, and incest with mother incest. Anyway, let's just leave that hanging over this text. Let's shift into his 2 main categories, the Dionysus and Apollo, the Dionysian and the Apollonian, the 2 gods, linked to the 2 gods, 2 Greek gods. Dionysus, you start with me. What are your god Dionysus? controversial. Dionysus is associated with
Doubt and fear.
Drunkenness.
drunkenness, god of wine.
But he's also associated with fertility as well.
Yes, yeah.
Because when you're intoxicated.
And yes, no. Wine, drunkenness, what else?
Chaos.
Chaos? Probably, yes. He's not
Emotion.
interested in order.
Ecstasy.
Ecstasy, wildness, bacchanalia. And his followers, the word comes from the Bacchantes, his followers.
I took it that he's very driven by instinct rather than
Yeah, completely.
rational thought.
There's actually his other name in Greek and then in Roman mythology is Bacchus, the god Bacchus. It's one and the same person. Anything else?
The primal oneness.
Yes, nature, in the state of nature, and Dionysus is linked to that. There is a sort of primal oneness, very
Which is
important category
collectivism,
here.
which is kind of what that was. The whole instinct, collectivism.
Yeah, wild dancing, you go get wildly drunk or
Be one
taking
with
various
your neighbour.
drugs and you lose yourself, lose the individual.
Not similar to Jung's collective consciousness.
No, nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with Jung's collective unconscious. Don't forget Jung, this is just confusing. Anything else with Dionysus? Apparently hermaphroditic, sort of not very masculine, not very male. So almost androgynous.
What about satyrs?
Yes.
Association?
Yeah. It was the famous the sort of processional followers of Dionysus, including satyrs. Satyr or satyrs, what is a satyr?
I feel like they're sort of half man, half beast. Like they've sort of got like horse ears or goat ears or something.
Horns.
They're-
Half God.
Half man, half goat, yeah. Yeah, and the goat association,
The devil.
the devil. Well, the devil comes later. It's not really here. It's a Christian thing, the devil. But so in the Greeks, it's not. The devil's probably false. No, it's not moralised.
Satyr.
Satyr or satyr? Satyr.
The association, like with them, like they've got this wild sex impulse.
Well, they're extremely libidinous, is Freud's term, driven by lust and by sadism, basically. Two impulses, lust and sadism. The goat is the sort of lust, sort of mythological association of goats with randiness, wild, sexual license, fertility. And satyrs are also stupid. The half man, half goat. Now, the association here, and especially in Nietzsche, is this is our. If you take away the veils of civilization and everything that is on the surface, underneath there's the satyr. This is one of the substratums of being human. The animal, the satyr, half man, half goat.
Nietzsche refers to it as the natural being on page.
Yeah,
But yeah.
the natural being. We'll look at some paintings in a few weeks' time. I'll show you images of the Dionysus and his followers and the satyrs. Goat's legs and feet. There's very few paintings in the National Gallery of Victoria and St Kilda Road which have got satyrs in them. You can easily these days you can Google anything, so it's very easy to pick up what the satyr is, or at least modern artistic representations of the satyrs look like. But so, in other words, wild animal impulse, particularly lust and sadism. Sadism, don't emphasise the lust at the expense of the other, which is taking pleasure in cruelty, taking pleasure in inflicting pain. another member of Dionysus' horde was
Oh, is it Silenus?
Silenus, yes. Silenus. Who Nietzsche is an important figure in Nietzsche's text. Anyone on who was Silenus? He's going to recur through this course in different forms. He keeps reappearing. We talked a bit about Dark Knight. The Joker figure in Dark Knight is a sort of reworking of Silenus, the Heath Ledger character. Silenus, the Greek Silenus, he's a lecher. He's a fat, drunken, repulsive lecher, basically. You see portraits of him, the fat man in the Western tradition. No moral constraint whatsoever. Is Dionysus, Dionysian in Nietzsche's terms. So he basically gropes any male or female he can get his hands on. Drunk, you've usually portrayed. I'll show you Rubens' painting of Silenus later on. And he's usually got very red, inflamed face, skin, lurching around. Those of you who know Shakespeare, Falstaff, figure of Falstaff in Shakespeare, who's praised in Silenus. The big challenge with Silenus, and again especially to us, and partly why Nietzsche wheels him on stage, is Silenus is wise. I mean, to the modern sensibility, you sort of think, well, he's just a really old, fat, repulsive, lecherous drunk. You wouldn't want anything to do with him. But he's the one who has wisdom. We're back slightly, with wisdom is a crime against nature. How? Why? How does that happen? And completely opposite to Socrates. Although, ironically, Socrates actually was a very ugly, physically very ugly, was often associated with Silenus because of his looks, which is really ironical, given it's the opposite in terms of philosophy. Any ideas on the wisdom of Silenus?
Is it the wisdom that turns him into a big fat drunken?
Maybe.
Is that part of that theme?
This is the myth. We've got the figure and we've got the wisdom. Maybe you can read him that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or is it because he does embrace life to the fullest
Mm-hmm.
that he also gains wisdom through the experience of
He lives.
pushing all the boundaries?
Yeah. If that's living, if what he does is living, then you can certainly read him that way. He's experienced everything. We'll come to Heart of Darkness, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a bit later in the course, and the central dark figure in that is very much like in that tradition. It's that Silenus tradition, although he's not, he's tall and thin. Anyone else on anything else on wisdom?
Kind of inverts the Socratic maxim that the only thing I know is that I do not know.
Yes.
The fact that he wouldn't even think of something like that makes him intrinsically a knower.
Yes. And only Socrates, only the virtuous are happy. It's completely at odds with all of that Socrates stuff. What about in The Birth of Tragedy? What Silenus appears very early on in The Birth of Tragedy. What's his advice to King Midas? King Midas approaches him as the wise man.
Is it better to be...
The best thing for a man is not to be born, and if already born, to die as soon as possible.
Yeah.
The best thing for Midas asked him, what's the best thing? What's your advice to us humans about how to live? And he laughs. Silenus just laughs and says, well, the best thing for you is not to be born. And if you have the misfortune of being born, the best thing is to die soon.
Don't make me tell you something I know that you don't really want to hear.
Yeah. It also plays on, in the German, plays on Hamlet's to be or not to be.
Yeah.
It's sort of nichts zu sein, not to be, and nothing, to be nothing, actually, is in the German nichts zu sein. So it's very much a Hamlet, playing on Hamlet's to be or not to be, in the way that Nietzsche presents him. So this is the specific wisdom of Nietzsche's Silenus. Die soon. Any more on the Dionysian before we... Nietzsche's basically saying that we humans live on two driving principles. The two principles govern our lives. One represented by Dionysus, the other governed by Apollo. These two Greek gods. The Dionysian is the satyr Silenus side of us, which seeks annihilation of the I, the individual, sort of wild abandon, and you know, let's not pretend that this is particularly nice. It's riddled with lust and sadism. You know, if you say shock horror, of course I'm not sadistic. I'm a nice person. I do not like to see other people suffering. Nietzsche would say, well, you're just kidding yourselves. You're just sort of polite, civilised modern people who've got no idea of who you really are. That's what he's saying. I'm presenting this as the Nietzsche view. Classical, and it is really the classical, the Homer view, the classical Greek view. So the Dionysian self under the surface is a driving throb of passions, of chaotic passions that we most of the time desperately try to get under control. Let's switch to Apollo. This is the more difficult of the two. Got Apollo?
Well, he consistently refers to Apollo as the image that, or the principle that individuates people in subjects.
It's associated with individualising, the individual principle. That we take pride in the fact we're individuals, distinctive, unique. Dreaming. It's associated strongly in Nietzsche's image with dreaming, that capacity for imagination, dreaming, fantasy.
Naive?
Yes, potentially naive.
Self-discipline?
Pardon?
Self-discipline.
Self-discipline, yes, the control, discipline. Apollo is the god of Delphi. Go to Delphi, and so I recommend anyone who survives this course to have to go to Delphi. Apollo is the god, and the two sayings of the Delphic oracle are
Know thyself.
know thyself. Go to that one first. Know thyself. And
Living in moderation.
yeah, moderation or nothing in excess.
Talks about the veil of Maya as well.
Yes, there's a lot here about the veil taking your attention off the Dionysian reality.
Which is like an illusion. It's meant to just be a...
The Apollo is partly linked by Nietzsche with the illusion. Right, Apollo is presiding deity at Apollo over the oracle. The main job of the Delphic oracle ran for 600 or 800 years. Probably the most powerful force in many ways in the ancient world. It wasn't just Greeks, it was Romans. People from the East came to consult the Delphic oracle. The Delphic oracle basically told you your fate. It was under the star of destiny or fate that I can read. I mean, my special power is to read you the individual, or you a people, your fate, what's going to happen. I can tell you the future. I often did it in riddles. Lots of famous stories of people who consult the oracle, misinterpreting what they're told, getting it completely wrong. So we've got this strange thing about Delphi in Greece. Site's still not Still in pretty good condition. The temple, all the other buildings that are there on the side of a mountain, halfway up. Mount Parnassus, 2 hours from Athens, 3 hours from Athens. We've got on the one hand, this is this site of fate, destiny. You've got no freedom. Oedipus goes to the Delphic oracle. The Delphic oracle tells him his fate, that you'll kill your father and marry your mother. Oedipus is horrified, as you know, any of you turn up at the Delphic oracle, and the Delphic oracle tells you you're going to kill your father and marry your mother, or vice versa if you're female. Oedipus does the obvious thing. He heads off in the opposite direction, away from where his parents are. Just as well, I'm free, I'm independent, I can defy this. I'll make sure I go and live somewhere else, and I'll never see my parents again. And then it'll be impossible for me to kill my father and marry my mother. Of course, what he doesn't know is his step-parents. They're not his real parents. And actually, it's on the very journey away from Delphi that he meets his father at the crossroads, at the foot of the mountain, and they get into a row, and he whacks his father over the head, actually kills him. And then he goes on to Thebes, where his mother is queen. His father had been king, and ends up, he saves Thebes through his intelligence, saves Thebes from the curse of a monster, and in reward he marries his mother, his queen, and becomes king.
When does he find out that he married his mother?
Slowly through the story. The story is all about his slow finding out about who he actually is. The know that he really breaks the know thyself without knowing it. He thinks he knows it. He thinks he's the man who knows everything, but he doesn't know the most important thing. So he breaks the know thyself.
Why wasn't he raised by his natural parents?
Because his father had heard the same oracle and didn't want to raise a son who was going to grow up and kill me and marry my wife, and so the father has him put out to die. But the servant who puts him out to die actually can't bring himself to do it, so he hands the baby over to. That's the detail of the story. Yes. So Apollo is this, on the one hand, is fate, on the other hand, there are these injunctions about knowledge, but a particular type of knowledge, know thyself. It may not be the same as Socrates' knowledge. And balance or moderation, nothing in excess. Not Dionysus. Anything else on the god Apollo? He's a sun god. He's associated with the sun, with brightness, light.
He's the son of Zeus.
He's the son of Zeus. He's a half-brother of Athena, the goddess of wisdom. His sister is Artemis or Diana, associated with the moon.
And here that he's concerned with appearances.
Nietzsche's reading, Apollo's concerned with the look of things, the appearances. So
If Apollo's the god of prophecy, is prophecy somewhat in line with knowledge? Because
yes.
prophecy is...
Well, in the Oedipus story, which is one, there's lots and lots of stories, what Oedipus gets wrong is he doesn't know himself. And as a result of not knowing himself, he doesn't know the most important thing about himself, which is who is my mother and who is my father. Also, Oedipus is cocky. He thinks that he's the great confident individual and thinks, this is all this Delphic oracle. Well, he believes the oracle, but superstition I can beat because I'm an intelligent, self-willed individual, and I'm going to, make my life. And in a way, the most important thing he doesn't know is that you cannot escape your fate. And the Apollo at Delphi mocks Oedipus for thinking that he can escape his destiny or his fate. This is part of Nietzsche's thing here, it's better not to know. In terms of, who, does anyone in this room want to know your future? No, I think most sensible humans do not want to know their future, do they? Because the fear is it might paralyse you. Yes?
I'd like to know some of the future, not my
like
future.
Like to know the nice things.
The lot of numbers would be the really handy one. Anything like that, but that's not really your own personal future, and that would change.
So you'd like to know the numbers next Saturday night?
or even the winner of a a sporting game, I can make a large bet.
Some of the good things would be good to know though, because then you could comfort yourself when you're going through the bad times that, well, I know there's something good that's going to happen in the future. It's
Right,
worth
so I just want to know, foresee the good.
Yeah.
And just be blind to that.
And then reckon.
And then?
And then reckon because you know.
Yeah, and then when the good's happening and then the bad suddenly strikes, you'll be cursing, won't you?
But I mean, what happens if you're like, you live a life like Edgar Allan Poe, where it's just onslaught and onslaught of misery, and so you tell the Oracle to say, you know, just tell me the good stuff, and they're like, well, I think we're done here.
People like your work.
You'll be remembered after you're dead.
Maybe you can consult his ghost and see if he actually would have liked to have known him during his life.
There was that TV show that was on a couple of years ago where everyone in the world passed out for a certain amount of time.
Fast forward.
Yeah. I don't remember when it happened to that show after the first season, but like, yeah, like that was that same sort of theory. You know, everyone saw their future, and people that saw blackness knew they'd, you know, died, and they lived their lives differently because they knew they were going to die. Whatever the time period was, I can't remember exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there are actually a lot of stories, aren't there, that time machines and that flirt with this fantasy that it might be nice to know the future, but then there's the fear that what you will actually see. Well, of course, the ultimate fear is you'll be confronted with the obvious fact that you're going to die. And in some ways, we'll probably prefer not. We sort of know it intellectually, but maybe perhaps, do you want to see the images of how you actually die? No. And what, does anyone?
Unless I die in my bed when I'm 100 or something like that. That might be okay to see.
With, yeah, okay.
But not if I'm going to die next week in a car crash. You want to see that.
Apollo, back to Apollo. Apollo's the difficult figure here, the whole business about illusion.
Is care for appearance, or the bit that sort of put that out, does that come back to that self-discipline and control, where he's trying to control, where you're trying to control the bit that's Dionysus?
The Dionysus bit.
So that appearance is about, you know, hiding that or keeping it in check?
Well, there are different, let's move on to that. This term that Nietzsche uses, and it really depends a bit on which translation you've been reading. This comes through in section 4. He talks about redemptive illusion. So you'll be with us a lot in this course. What Apollo, the principle of Apollo provides is redeeming illusions, not truths. This is the appearance or illusions or imaginings that somehow redeem our lives, that make them meaningful and worthwhile. Nietzsche's reading of Hamlet is the sort of using this category. Did anyone make sense of it? Why is Hamlet paralysed according to Nietzsche?
He's seen the real truth.
Yeah, he's seen the real truth, and the real truth is that life is
Painful.
yes, painful, but it's quite specific. He's got that life is, Nietzsche has important formula. Two things, either this or that. This is what Hamlet sees. The reality, the truth about human existence. It is either, you want to pick this up? No. Horrible or absurd. Hamlet sees the truth about human existence, that if you're honest, it's either horrible or absurd. And in Hamlet's case, both. The killing of his father, the horror, or absurd. Now, if that's the truth you see, that what's the meaning, the to be or not to be question, what's the deep meaning of existence? It's life is either horrible or absurd. Then what's the point in doing anything? That's what this is Nietzsche's reading of Hamlet. That's what paralyses Hamlet.
I felt that in chapter 2, section 2, part 2, whatever, he was talking up Apollo in the sense that Apollo was a hero. And like he talks about the dream as being a positive thing.
Yes.
And how it's, and when you can see the dream and realize that it's a dream, be aware that it is a dream, you are able then to produce art and interpretation of that dream through your actions, like artists do in their art.
And it's art that produces the most potent redeeming illusions or truths. Nietzsche's ambiguous about this, whether it's all is either.
So art is the truth because it's kind of like the outlet. Is that what you're saying?
Didn't you say that beautiful works of art are compensation for the horrors of life?
Yes, and he uses Raphael's Transfiguration in section 4. The painting will, those of you who don't know, will show in a few weeks' time. The bottom half of Raphael's Transfiguration is just a sort of chaos of a mad boy, parents who are beside themselves because their son's mad, doctors, disciples who can't cure the boy. There's just a sort of chaos of darkness and confusion and madness. In the top half of the painting there's an image of transfigured Jesus, Jesus transfigured. The boy looks up and he sees transfigured Jesus. And Nietzsche's reading of the painting is this is a redeeming illusion. The boy sees an image of transcendent, religious, sacred image of Jesus up above, redeeming. And at that point he regains his sanity. Now the job of culture in that view is to provide the most powerful redemptive illusions. We have endless trivial redeeming illusions about our lives. You know, how I'm going to win Tats Lotto on Saturday night. I'm going to, suddenly things are going to change.
New Year's Eve New Year's resolutions.
New Year's resolutions. Or if you actually believe them, yeah. I'm going to be a new person this year because of the resolutions I've taken on New Year's Eve. What about other examples? It's a necessary part of living.
Yes, but that's hope. That's what gets you through. Is that things are going to get better. That things are going to be good in
or
the future.
in specific ways.
Yeah.
And that's why it's better not to know your fate because it might actually cancel out any sense of hope.
Is romance usually a redemptive illusion? This is the soul
Yes.
This is going to transform my life. I mean, that's a powerful redeeming. Sometimes it turns out to be true, though, doesn't it? There are relations that endure and marriages that are good and so forth.
Do they still have the romance?
Do they still have the romance? Well, this is the territory in which we're now moving. Pardon?
The pictures people share on Facebook, you know, these people have been together for such and such a time. Like, you don't believe the stories, but like the stories exist, you know.
Facebook, the ultimate redeeming illusion.
Yeah.
We all is flooded.
It's great for learning about people and how people act when they're not in real life. That like, I don't know, it's sort of the opposite of good. Like, yeah, there's and all that's entire internet. Really, people act under a veil of, you know, a username and say things they wouldn't.
I mean, the creative personality on Facebook.
Yeah.
This is a dream. This is my dream persona as opposed to the real persona. This is a redemptive illusion. Looks like Apollo in this negative sense, or in part. Well, for Nietzsche too, that knowledge is somehow the pursuit of knowledge and understanding is going to make us happier and happier people and better people. It's sort of the dominant modern redemptive illusion. It's illusory. It's not true. I mean, the implication is it's not true. But we need this to keep our eyes off the horror and the absurdity.
Which is why you think Apollo to disguise Dionysus, that way. Because then he goes on to speak about how when, I think, is it Oedipus, or remove the Dionysus from the Greek tragedy plays.
Euripides. Euripides.
Yeah, and therefore it wasn't Greek tragedy anymore, it was just beauty rather than pining.
And hope and optimism. Yeah, and avoiding the core Dionysian reality.
So is that why Dionysian talks about the primal oneness, so emerging your identity in the mass, and that's the way that they avoid the horror and the absurdity of life, because they just basically lose their awareness in the
Well, we need to move on in the argument to get there. There's the Nietzsche, the powerful culture, the only culture that works, is a fusion then of the two principles of Apollo and Dionysus. You've got a sort of primitive Dionysus, which is getting drunk or taking ecstasy or whatever and just wild dancing for 12 hours when you lose yourself. That's a sort of classic satyr. That's the sort of satyr Dionysus. But there's a sort of tragic Dionysian where it's actually through tragedy the sense of the I of the individual is annihilated. Oedipus' sense of himself, most admirable, intelligent human being, is annihilated by the knowledge that I've killed my father and married my mother and had 4 children with her, as it would. So this is a sort of tragic Dionysian and return to the oneness of existence, where all your normal hopes and desires and pleasures and ambitions are wiped away through tragedy.
I thought it was a lot to do, that aspect had a lot to do with like feeling closer to God, because I like there is a sense of nirvana about it, like the primal unity, talking about collectivism, and only when you reach that sense of togetherness and ecstasy are you in that optimum state, which is very similar to what Buddhism is.
Yeah, that's
And that's the first bit of Buddhism, isn't it? That suffering exists.
Yeah, transcending the I.
Yep.
Transcending the I and its everyday pleasures and ambitions. Yeah, well, Nietzsche's oneness of existence has a lot of in parallel with that. The veils of Maya and all of that.
The idea of transcendence in that kind of notion assumes that there must be an amount of will in that on the part of the individual to do that. Whereas I think with the notion of the Dionysius is that it's about annihilating that I, destroying it, so that it disappears entirely, rather than overcoming it, it's destroyed.
Why does there have to be will? Can you give an example?
I don't know, something like I'm sick of being a bartender, I want to become an accountant, transcend that notion of yourself in point in time. I mean, it's a banal example, but I think what the Dionysius does is sort of annihilates those quotidian sort of things that differentiate you between others. Then that's what creates the connection with the primal oneness.
Yeah, although Nietzsche's reading of tragedy is, in tragedy, through extreme suffering, just as annihilates your sense of self. It's not like waking up one morning and saying, I don't want to be a bartender anymore, I want to be an accountant.
No, yeah, exactly. But, I mean, that's one possibility of it, I guess.
I don't understand how tragedy can do that. So, what the rationale behind it?
Well, if you read Oedipus the King, for example, see it film or on stage, I mean, I think it's like, do any of you know famous? One of the strange things about it, that rationally, nothing could be more horrible than to be Oedipus. And the slow recognition that who I am, I've killed my father, married my mother, and had 4 children. And he then he stabs out his own eyes, and he banishes himself to live alone for the rest of his life, a bit half his life, actually on the hillside where he was put out as a baby to die. Now, rationally, you think, oh, the horror, basically, what the worst possible fate is Oedipus. And yet, reading the story, the tragedy, there is something uplifting and exhilarating about it. There's this sort of strange contradiction. It's got something to do with the fact the work of art is an ordered whole. it sort of transforms the horror. The work does it. And you probably will all know. The Searchers is a case. It starts with tragedy, the massacre of a family, and attempts the restoring of order. It follows the model of Greek tragedy in that film, according to Nietzsche. Obviously didn't know it. But by the end, there is a sense of order and
Truth.
pardon?
Truth.
Truth, yeah, and calm. In spite of the rational details, which are really, no one would want to be in that story. No one would want to be Oedipus. Nietzsche's wrestling with this.
It's like an illustration of good and evil. It's moral. It's a story about morals. If evil is done, we only feel calm if that evil is punished in some way.
I think it's almost...
Maybe that can be an example. It's not one of Nietzsche's examples of where there's retribution and restitution for justice. When justice ends up, that you could use that as an example. It's not one of Nietzsche's examples.
Is it almost just finding a way to live with the evil? Like finding the calm?
Well, in his case, it's more learning to live with the Dionysian reality.
Is it an acceptance of fate that life sucks and that's just the way it is, and there is suffering, and we just...
Well, fate's two-edged, because if actually you believe in fate, then you believe this is sort of, someone's written the script. There's a sort of order beyond. It's not completely negative philosophy. If you believe that my life is scripted, or at least the important things in my life are somehow scripted, I don't know who wrote the script. The Greeks, they play around with all sorts of different stories of fates and all of that wrote the script. But they don't have much doubt that there is a script. And that script is inescapable. That's both a negative and a positive.
Isn't that the thing with tragedy then, that like it creates an observable world, but which in itself is a coherent sort of narrative that we can observe and rationally deal with. But the thing about the Dionysiac is that it represents that these individuals themselves can't actually comprehend that. And that would be the distinguishing thing between the two faiths that you mentioned before.
No, I think they comprehend it more.
Who comprehends it more?
Dionysiacs comprehend. Do you mean?
You mean primitive Dionysiacs or tragic?
No, I mean about understanding, because they're trying to obsess with dealing with tragedy, trying to understand it through art and music and through. So, they understand it a bit more, but they're not trying to rationalise it, which is what the Socratic thinking does. Is try and rationalise it.
Yeah. Well, Nietzsche says take the Dionysian out, which is the tendency in the modern West, and you don't live. Basically, you become like an obsessive neurotic. You're racing around, maintaining meaningless order all the time, filing systems, and workaholism, or pruning trees, or whatever the symbols of washing too often. Because it's denying the sort of the Dionysian underneath. If there's only Dionysian, then there's just chaos. Like, Nietzsche didn't like the Romantic movement in poetry. It's basically thought it was too much Dionysian, too uncontrolled, too unbalanced.
He's saying they both need He's saying they both need each other.
Yeah.
And it's about maybe getting the
tension between the two, which in his leading example of that is Greek tragedy.
Too much Apollonian, he says, sort of sterilises culture as well.
Yeah, it sterilises life.
Yeah.
You don't live. But he regarded philosophers as too much Apollo, not enough Diana.
Is that that started with Socrates, did it?
That's his argument,
Sort of
yeah.
scientific thought and rationale.
And more, just a series of assumptions about the good life. Not even scientific, because you can be rational in all sorts of ways. But the Socrates assumptions about what is the good life.
Like there is a certain way to know, the Dionysian is, we can't squash that, you know, that energy, and that people are going to drink and they're going to enjoy themselves, they're going to, is that sort of, you can't...
And modern psychotherapy's got lots of examples of extreme repression, where it just cracks and, you know, there's outbursts of violence or outbursts of, you know, emotions that have been checked for so long, too much, suddenly explode. That's becoming a bit clearer.
Since for every concept I think I start to get, there's something else that I just go
Another way.
Well, we're going through the principal concepts today, and there'll be bits of the text that's still bewildering, even at the end. So there's a general case about modern West has gone too far in the Apollo direction. I mean, Freud says the same thing, we become too civilised, there's too much repression, there's too much inhibition of the instincts.
Political correctness.
Pardon?
Political correctness.
Yeah, political correctness would be...
You did mention about how with Socrates you should be able to have an honest discussion about criticism and about self-criticism and about other people as well, and not take it to offence because you're just together trying to reach that self-evaluation. But that wouldn't happen today because you're too polite.
Even that wouldn't happen, no. Well, it does. I mean, you get figures like Sam Newman on the footy show. He's sort of the escape of the Dionysian or the non-politically correct.
I was going to say, I think in the youth there's a huge Dionysian movement. The just like
in revolt.
Give everyone's thoughts to hell. Like we're going to do whatever we want.
Well, being a teenager is Dionysian rebellion. Before Apollo usually wins in that one. The big issue for us from now on is going to be what's illusion and what's truth. What is illusory? I mean, Ethan in the Searchers sort of takes an oath in the way I read it a few weeks ago. Now, is that an illusion or is it truth? We'll see lots of examples where it's obviously an illusion. That's people are under an illusion or a delusion. She's deluding herself or she's dreaming. Telling he's dreaming. A modern way of saying that they're deluding themselves.
But isn't truth relative always?
Well, no, not really. I mean, Oedipus kills his mother, kills his father, and it's happened, it's real. And marries his mother, it's happened. He did visit the Delphic Oracle, and the Delphic Oracle turned out to be right about what was going to happen.
Wouldn't it be a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Pardon?
What's under the self-fulfilling prophecy? So it was technically an illusion to start off with until he heard about his fate and then fulfilled it? If he was never told he was going to sleep with his parents, he never would have tried to run away from his step-parents to go sleep with his parents.
Why didn't his step-parents tell him that they were his step-parents?
I
would have solved the whole problem.
I think he didn't check his
I thought Oedipus didn't hear the prophecy until after he'd already had 4 children. He was put out as a baby, and then...
No. In fact, there are rumours, when he's living at his step-parents' court in Corinth, there are rumours about him. And father killer, all sorts of rumours that get him worried. And as a result of those rumours, he goes up to Delphi, not far away from Corinth, to consult the oracle. And it's on the very journey down from having consulted the oracle, he believes the oracle. He heads in the opposite direction to where his parents live, and it's on that very journey he kills his father and ends up marrying his mother.
But maybe if your fate's written, it wouldn't matter what he did to try and escape it, it would still happen. So even if he sort of went, oh, I'm just going to stay here, not knowing they're his step-parents, but sort of...
That's not how it works in the story. The story is that you cannot escape your fate.
Yeah.
You know?
But what I'm saying is that he might have tried to do something different, but it still would have happened.
Well, you can end up
anyway.
as a sort of pathetic human response, if only I hadn't done that, or if only I'd stayed at home or he hadn't got.
Told. If originally his father hadn't been told and he hadn't been told that this would have happened, then the circumstances upon which did happen would not have happened.
Yeah.
So in this sense, the prophecies or the mayor or whatever, the fortune tellers, for lack of a better term, the horoscopes, they're setting fate when that's not their job. The job there is to prophesise fate, and the mirror are about writing the fate.
It's just like that bit from The Matrix when he goes and sees the oracle and she goes, watch out, and then he knocks over the vase and she says, but what's really going to bake your cookie later is whether you still would have looked it over if I didn't say watch out.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter because everything that we do is affected by what came before it. Like he wouldn't have gone to see the oracle if he hadn't had the runes.
Yeah.
So
in the
The oracle is
Stepdad
not
just would have been like, hey, by the way.
But like, they're becoming the instruments upon which it happens.
They play a role. That's certainly true.
So they're almost that, in a sense, because the father went to the oracle and then the son went to the oracle. They're almost writing the fate upon which it happens.
The story doesn't read like that. The story reads that the oracle is just simply saying this is what will happen. This is the script. I didn't write the script. The oracle doesn't write the script.
Do you know the soul sign prophecy?
The what?
Soul sign prophecy.
The seller.
Soul sign.
It's what Carl's saying. It's if you, it's almost like subliminal messaging. If you expect something to happen, then it's more likely to happen than not.
If you expect something to happen, it's more likely.
So that's like the placebo effect, almost.
But that I mean, we humans spend a lot of time daydreaming about rewriting the past or if only this will happen, and usually it doesn't. Most of it goes through our conscious or unconscious minds actually doesn't happen. I mean, daydreams are sort of if only it did, but it doesn't. What do you think about this sort of fated? I mean, this is right at the centre of this Greek mythos view is that somehow things are fated.
Is knowing what's going to happen, is that in alignment with wisdom? So they're both equally bad? I mean, if Nietzsche's saying wisdom is bad, is prophecy bad? Is knowing
Well,
the future?
to know thyself, really that's an issue of what sort of knowledge. Nietzsche mentions in passing Cassandra. Do we have any Cassandras? No, it's not a very good thing. Very context for your daughter. Cassandra's, she appears a lot in Greek mythology, but the most powerful presence is in the Agamemnon. She's really the hero of the story. She's a daughter of Priam, king of Troy. So she's captured at the end of the Trojan War, which the Trojans lose to the Greeks. Agamemnon's the king of the Greeks. He takes her off home as slave booty, concubine, mistress, slave, brings her home to his palace in Mycenae, in Peloponnese. You can go to Mycenae today, Hobbitt's still there. And he's been away 10 years fighting. He's met by his wife, Clytemnestra. He arrives home in his chariot with lots of booty, plus Cassandra. And Cassandra sees the future. She's got the power of knowing. She sees the future, and she sees that Agamemnon's wife is about to kill both Agamemnon and her, so she sees she's about to die. Now she has this sort of knowledge that probably none of us would really want, of just seeing, and it's the horrible. My life is, she says, a sheer edge of the tearing iron, and she wails. But in the fragments of the story, she somehow manages to gather herself in spite of the horror of what she sees, and manages to walk in through the gate of the fortress, and with sort of incredible dignity. Now she has, in Nietzsche's text about knowledge, know thyself, she has the most profound knowledge of all, what's about to happen. And, well, in one of the, she gets punished Apollo tries to seduce her during the Trojan War, and she doesn't want anything to do with him. So, and part of his seduction is he gives her the gift of prophecy, and then in irritation with her rejecting him, he curses her that no one will ever believe her. And so she's got this sort of strange insight that no one else will believe. She's a very powerful figure. She really comes to the question of what knowledge are we talking about? This is not Socrates' knowledge. Socrates' knowledge is easy for us all to understand. You know, you're in a drama in life, you want to work what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, and you use your powers of reason. Work out what's the best thing to do. That's easy to understand. Cassandra is a very different sort of knowledge. It's almost wisdom is a crime against nature, her sort of knowledge. But somehow there's an aura, like Oedipus, there's a sort of aura that comes with her knowledge. Tragic, she's a tragic figure, again, very much a tragic figure. She's the really lead tragic figure in Agamemnon. And there's almost a sort of redeeming, sort of transcending, or something uplifting, however horrible the story about Cassandra. Now this is an example of Nietzsche's culture takes something horrible and creates something redeeming about it. There's one of the things at issue here, and we'll be discussing this again and again through this course, of the type of knowledge we're talking about. What type of knowledge? What type of knowledge do you want? Who would want to be Cassandra?
Is the uplifting bit of that story the fact that she was able to look?
Yeah, she's
through
not
her
crushed.
fate with,
She's not paralysed. She's not like Hamlet, she's not paralysed.
Yeah.
Just like Ethan is not paralysed by seeing the horror of what happens to his family.
Yeah.
With the rape and the scalping and all of that. Yeah, she's not paralysed. She's not a Hamlet. The Hamlet is one extreme in our categories here. The one who is paralysed by what he sees. Then there are the figures who are not paralysed.
But I mean, she's been confronted with accepting her fate for her whole life, whereas Hamlet just had it in that one instance.
Yes, true. Yeah.
So
You mean she's got used to
Right.
she's got used to being strong.
Right. And I mean, she had to have known, like, since she knew that she was able to see the future, that one day she'd probably end up seeing her dad.
Yeah. Also, she's a bit like Debbie and Ethan, that her knowledge separates her off from other ordinary humans. Like, you know, you can't imagine her marrying or having children or settling down to a normal life. It's not her.
Also too, like, I mean, yeah, I guess it's a bit like getting used to it, but if she knows that what she foresees is actually going to happen and there is no way of avoiding it, then, yeah, you would get to the point of why fight against it, because...
Well, she is horrified though. She arrives at the doors of the gate of the fortress.
She only sees stuff that's going to happen to her.
Feeding challenge.
No, she sees that Troy, her city's going to fall to the Greeks.
She just sees the future, because really, like, if she sees the future of what's going to happen to her, couldn't she... I mean, I know we're saying that, like, you can't change fate, but couldn't she, like, arguably change it, because every decision you make before something is about to happen makes it happen?
Well, this actually happens to Troy. She tells her people, the Trojans, this is going to happen, do something about it, but they don't listen, they don't believe her.
Then you could have taken steps. Because you burned the giant horse and then be like, oh look, there were bricks in there. Bam, I was right.
They probably would have carted her off and stuck her in a room somewhere while they went to go sacrifice it to Poseidon.
Yeah, well,
He was sceptical about fate.
yeah, a little.
But haven't you read those stories where they try and avoid their fate in one way, but then something else happens to get
And then end up still getting there anyway.
Gets you anyway, so like a meteor lands and destroys.
You must be a deep fatalist. You're resisting this so strongly.
Somebody else is writing the lives.
Don't like the idea, do you?
We're trying to set it all
Modern day
right by
sense of control.
using Socratic reasoning.
But the point isn't just the fate, is it? Like, it's in terms of where Nietzsche, in terms of Nietzsche's argument, that he's talking about a lack of control. It's not necessarily that someone wrote a script. He's using these key figures to illustrate the meaning of life.
Yeah,
I guess.
he is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's the reality about the human condition, the individual condition? The reality is that there's the forces of Dionysus, there's the controlling forces of Apollo. That's, I Nietzsche am using these images. You could use other ones if you wanted to.
Yeah. This is what real culture does. It does what Greek tragedy does, because we desperately need it for life to be bearable. To be able to live with the Dionysian. Yes.
And if you don't have that culture, the Dionysian will torture you, or you'll repress it completely, so you won't live.
Yep.
I mean, there are endless stories that you can bring up to illustrate this. There's a study by Herbert Hendon of college students in America in the 80s. And one of his examples, it could be a Freudian case study, is a girl who sort of calls the rat girl, who American college student. She comes to Hendon's a psychoanalyst. She comes to him. She's very unhappy with her life, and she tells him a dream. She has a dream of a glass of water, which is perfectly calm and clear. She looks into the glass of water, and at the bottom there's a rat bleeding at the tail. And his reading of this is, well, your life on the surface is like the glass of water. It's calm, clear, ordered, but your fear is that down at the bottom there's a rodent, obviously female association with the bleeding, and you desperately don't want. And it turns out that whenever she was getting involved with boys, she would stop relationships the moment they become serious, because she was scared. The analyst reading, she was scared that she would become passionate. The passion would come out, and that if passion comes out, in my case, it's destructive. It's the rat, and it will destroy. I'd rather not get involved in relationships than have the threat of emotion, passion, Pascaline, coming out. So she threw herself into her studies, did very well for a time being, but after a while found that life was bringing her no pleasure. You sort of cut off the Dionysian, and the forces of love and drama and dynamism that make life engaging. Then even your work will lose its pleasure. Engaging work needs to be fed by Dionysian forces, otherwise it's boring and lifeless. And we all know that experience. Now the implication there in the Nietzsche terms is there's no culture to hold her hand, to help her live with her demon or demons, her fear. And so the result is complete repression or denial, or not living. Now Hamlet's a male case, which you could read in very similar terms.
Where does Nietzsche find the value in the sort of sadistic side of...
There's no value, that's the reality. He's not putting a value on it. He just says that's how it is. You may not like the idea, but that's how it is.
But he's saying that if we repress it, it will always... He's saying that we need to engage in it.
Yeah, it needs to engage with culture so that it lives its way out. I mean, you could say that something like football is a way of young males can play out a huge amount of violence in a controlled, regulated environment without hardly ever doing real damage to other players. I mean, that's a fairly obvious example. Michelangelo sort of bashes away at marble for decades and decades. Huge amount of violence goes into sculpting marble. Then he creates beautiful objects. And probably sadistic violence goes into that. I mean, they're examples of culture at work where something that's potentially destructive, as in the case of the rat girl, actually then finds a form, finds a way of animating her life. And the person can actually live and take some pleasure in them. Work in which there's not some sort of, even writing essays, unless there's some sort of Dionysian engagement with your essays in this course, they're not going to be very good. Now, where the Dionysus is going to come from, I don't know. A bit of luck it'll come from what you're reading, from what you're thinking about, and how that relates back to your own experience. And if that comes off, relating back to your own experience, then there will be engagement and dynamism. And almost invariably, the essay will be a lot better.
I'm going to make a bit of a statement point in the discussion and speak about the essays. The short essay, which is due in 2 weeks, I'm not...
Will you get the topic in 2 weeks?
I will get the topic in 2 weeks?
Yes.
Okay.
And you've got a few weeks to do it. Okay. It's not, I'm not that sadistic. It will feel like punishment. Not that extreme. All right, is this getting a bit clearer?
Yes.
Yes. Let's switch back to the annihilation of the I. Then, we get in the primitive Dionysian the annihilation of the sense of me. And Nietzsche doesn't write in these terms, but most of our discomfort comes from insecurities about self, doesn't it? Worries about, I'm not doing this very well, that's not working, or pains of existence, or if you start to think about it, tend to be caught up with the I and its vanities and insecurities. Now, Nietzsche's image of tragedy, this is partly repeating what's coming earlier, is tragedy destroys the I. And it actually frees you. You think it looks terrible, Oedipus, it looks terrible what's happened to Oedipus, but actually it's liberating at the same time. You're freed from your normal worries and hopes and ambitions and pleasures. And there is this sort of, regarded as Buddhist, this liberation of self to join what he calls the oneness of existence. It's a sort of like this cosmic oneness.
This reminds me of like Durkheim's theory of individualism. Is that yay or nay?
The collective is a bit like, Durkheim's collective is a bit like that, but it's very much a social community, not... Nietzsche wouldn't like Durkheim at all, whereas he doesn't believe in communities. Now this is really individual-centred, like Western religion. And then the admirable tragic figures are like Cassandra and Oedipus. They're not crushed. They're not like Hamlet. They're not crushed by this annihilation of the I. He talks about metaphysical solace, sort of comfort, metaphysical comfort, sort of spiritual, sacred comfort that comes through tragedy. And we're not talking, you get some sense of this from primitive Dionism. When you sort of go wild or in sport, or it's not just at drunken parties, but in sport, when you really throw yourself into something, team sport, you can do it. Where you lose your sense of I, you're just part of a larger whole. And there is a sort of something exhilarating and uplifting about that experience. Nietzsche's undoubtedly right about that. But it's really in the cultural tragic, in the cultural tragedy, where that becomes, in terms of making sense. That won't give you any meaning, really. I mean, you go to the party, you wake up the next morning with a headache, and it hasn't really changed anything. Whereas the tragic Dionism is different. So there's a really, the core of it is a sense of the annihilation of the I, the self, which is identified with Apollo. And maybe one of the strongest examples, Oedipus has a very powerful I. He's very confident, he becomes king, he's a very good king, he's very intelligent, very perceptive, like Hamlet, except he's much more active than Hamlet.
In the first chapter, he talks about Schopenhauer and how his passage is about serenity and trust, and that when they reach sublime understanding, they reach an Apollo principle. Because the opposite, which is a Dionysiac, which is doubt and fear, means when you become impulsive and subjective, and thus you forget yourself. Thus, your emotion clouds your judgment, so you can't really be, Apollo-like.
Because passion's taken over.
Exactly.
Well, it depends on the story where he draws a lot, Nietzsche draws a lot from the earlier German philosopher Schopenhauer. Nietzsche, by the way, was only 25 when he wrote this.
And going crazy.
He went mad at the age of 1989, at the age of 45.
Is it known what type of madness? Syphilis was
Well, it's sort of catatonic. He sort of withdrew into not speaking, not engaging with anybody, and virtually not speaking. His mother's attic. I mean, one theory is he had syphilis, but there's no really strong evidence. It may be true. There's no really convincing case I know about why he goes mad. He lived a very solitary existence, and he was a professor at age 24, very young, but then resigned after 10 years because he had migraines and stomach troubles, and spends the rest of his sane life just travelling on his own. Very solitary figure. He almost becomes gobbled up in his own categories. But his one philosophers tend to be really good when they're young or really good when they're old. Nietzsche's certainly the case of when he's young.
Was there tragedy in his life, like in his childhood?
Particularly not that we know about, no. No.
Yeah.
But so we've got the Dionysus Apollo, the two opposing principles. We've got the question then of what is Apollo linked with truth or illusion? Yeah. This is a distinction that's going to worry us for the rest of this course. What's illusion and what's truth? Many of you know Ibsen, the Norwegian playwright. And he introduces the notion of saving lives, that everyone has a saving lie that makes their life bearable. There's a painful character in the story who goes around exploding everyone's saving lives. And they commit suicide, go crazy, or destroys them all, basically. But it's probably a less interesting idea than Nietzsche's redemptive illusions.
When you say saving lives, what when you say saving lives, so like the lies we tell ourselves that
I believe I'm a great writer, and it's just tomorrow I'm going to start with the great Australian novel. It never happens. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I believe that that person I've just met is going to be the love of my life. And, just he or she will suddenly see the truth. I've actually forgotten the particular saving lies in Ibsen, but it doesn't take a lot of imagination to find equivalence. And in the stories that we continue to come across, we'll see lots of examples of redeeming illusions. I mean, the moment you realise it's not true, of course, it's no longer redemptive. that loses its power to save. But remember, the Dionysian is lust and sadism. It's not just sort of enjoying yourself, having a good time. It is love. It's the satyr. We've gone down the path of way too much Apollo, so we say, no, that's not me. Shock horror, I'm a nice person. We've gone so far down that path that actually we don't get enough pleasure out of what we do anymore. We've become apathetic without pathos. So the mythos is weakened, the pathos is weakened. So the pleasures have got less. There's something, Nietzsche has this thing about the cheerfulness of the ancient Greeks. He talks about their hair-raising cheerfulness. That, this is people where you hear the most horrendous tragedies and people who do such terrible things to each other, and yet out of this comes a very buoyant culture full of cheerfulness. Whereas you get too much Socrates, too much Apollo, you're going to have apathy, boredom, half-hearted desires, neurosis. You get the picture. I think we'll have a 20-minute break and then come back and talk about Socrates. That last part of the argument. Someone left their copy of Nietzsche here last week.
I broke down eventually Sunday. I think that at this point.
Another story. Next week, the Magdalene archetype. The reading, much more straightforward than this one. Although it isn't. 3 sections from the Bible, the New Testament, Luke, John and John. As I mentioned before, preferably the King James or Authorised Version, but whichever Bible you get your hands on. Readings on the program. You get online if you have to. Very, very, very accessible. In the actual Bible, there's fragments of this story. And one of the interesting things about it is really only 1,500 years later in Renaissance art, and we'll be looking at a number of paintings from the Renaissance. It's only 1,500 years later that the story starts to take its full form. It's one of the strange characteristics of archetypal story we're going to come across. Sometimes they take a long time to develop full form. And many of you probably know the Da Vinci Code, do you? That's the Magdalene story in modern, or one version. Princess Diana drew a lot, her actual story drew a lot on the Magdalene archetype. You'll see it, American film Pretty Woman. This is just absolutely straight, slightly trivialised, revisiting of the Magdalene theme. We'll be looking at what's the essence of this story. And it's actually, once we get into a close reading of the text, I think it's more interesting in its original form. So we're looking at the figure of Mary Magdalene, which is in itself also full of contradictions. I wouldn't bother with secondary literature, just read the Bible. Relief from Nietzsche. Straightforward, and we'll be looking at quite a few paintings as we fill out that story next week. Any questions about Magdalene?
Do you have any things we should keep in mind or questions to guide our reading?
With Magdalene?
Just read it.
What's going on? And she really does keep, there's reworkings of the story absolutely all the time. She's a sort of flawed character, fallen woman. She's actually a prostitute in the story, but doesn't need to be. Diana obviously wasn't. Flawed character that somehow there's some sort of transformation, metamorphosis happens.
Is she real? Like, was she like?
Did she happen? Did we know? We don't know anything about. We've got 4 stories about Jesus, and we don't know anything apart from the 4 stories. Anyway, we're dealing with mythos here, the story. Diana was real. I think we can assume Diana. But the question with something like Diana is why was everyone so interested in her? Basically, she was a neurotic mess with a very unusual and privileged background. So, why the world? Absolute fascination. It's not just Magdalene. This is Carroll's story, but a number of other archetypes obviously going on with Diana. But the Magdalene is perhaps the most powerful. So it's the mythos that matters, not whether actually we can prove that she existed and she did this and she did that. I mean, there's no hard evidence that Jesus existed. We've got 4 stories. A couple of historians a lot later refer to him, but they only say it wasn't Jesus Christ and he got crucified. So there's no...
It's thought that Mary Magdalene could have married Jesus.
Yeah, there's one.
Right.
There's thousands of may have married Jesus, maybe not. Anyway, we're dealing with what we can deal with. There's a special relationship between Magdalene and Jesus. We can say that. We'll deal with this next week. I want to start with section 23, which we'll come back to. One of the most important sections in the birth of tragedy. He says things, without myth every culture loses the healthy natural power of its creativity. In the second paragraph, and translations will vary here, but there's one line, the one which I want to, where he says about the 3rd, 4th, 5th line in. Let us think of a culture that has no fixed and sacred primordial site. This is sort of a suggestion that the basis of any culture is a fixed and sacred primordial site, which is a fairly accurate translation of the German. Fixed and that's the Kaufman translation that I'm using. Other versions of that here?
Is this the 4th line in to 23?
No, the second paragraph.
Yeah, I've got.
Let
us imagine a culture which has no fixed and sacred original seat.
Fixed and original seat. That's not as good.
Mine says site.
Site. In the German it's with the word for archetype, sort of archetypal things, you get clumsy in German. I'm investing in Heiligen Vorsitz. With the you are, it's a sort of arcane. Alright, any ideas what he's saying? Every culture needs a fixed and sacred site. Sacred sites didn't emerge with Australian Aboriginal references, by the way. Nietzsche's the first to use this term that I know. Someone may have used it before. This is 1872.
You need a story.
Sorry, creational stories?
Sacred site story. For him it's a myth. Yeah, but site we tend, like with Aboriginal sacred sites, don't we tend to think of places?
It's not so much, I wouldn't say it's so much a place in the idea of site as just a place where you can gather. It doesn't have to be specific, like a specific area, but it just has to have meaning, I guess. So like for instance, the church is not specifically a place at a specific locations, but no matter where a church is, that's a sacred primordial site for campus.
Wherever people congregate and pray.
There's something, it is a sort of sacred site. What about every culture's based or founded on a sacred site? It's using probably stronger than that.
Well, primordial, like origin.
In the beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. For example?
I mean, there's like Plymouth Rock in
the United States.
States.
It's a sort of founding sacred primordial site, yeah. Mount Fuji in Shinto, Japanese.
Bethlehem for Christians?
Pardon?
Bethlehem for Christians?
Well, for Christians, what is the site? Is it Jerusalem? Is it Galilee? Is it Bethlehem? Is it Rome? It's actually a bit harder in Christianity to where Jesus was crucified, Jerusalem.
There's a tree in which Buddha was enlightened underneath. That
It's
is
a sacred site, yeah. Or Benares for Hinduism, on the river, the sacred river. It's a sort of sacred site, isn't it, to Hinduism? And in Islam, Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, there's a few sacred sites, actual places.
Uluru.
Pardon?
Uluru.
Uluru? Except, in reality, Australian Aborigines were in very much different groups, each with its own sacred sites. So it wasn't like a nation with one sacred site. But Uluru, as an example of a sacred
The
site.
rainbow serpent came out of Rock in the Dreamtime story, that's why.
That is alright, that's a fixed and from a long time ago, archetypal site. Is it true? Every culture needs a fixed and sacred primordial site.
Like if you look at today's culture, like like the MCG for grand final day,
That's sort of secular sacred site. Or Gallipoli in Australian national mythology.
Is that the thinking around like a lot of cities have got like city squares or town squares, things like that?
They tend to be secular though, aren't they? Yeah. Civic and secular rather than religious. Yeah. The religious would rather be St. Peter's or Westminster. Sacred.
Yeah, sorry, I missed the sacred.
But sacred, does sacred have to mean religious, or does it just mean that's something that someone holds religiously?
Sacred means the opposite of profane. It means to do with divine. It's got divinity, or yes, it's got religion pretty much implicit in it.
Could be myths and traditions.
Yeah, okay, then it's actually the story that becomes the sacred site. Yeah, that's certainly closer to what Nietzsche's arguing, isn't it?
Well, they can unify. Sorry, they can actually unify a culture together.
Like a Bible, or an equivalent to a Bible, the sacred text.
And are places only sacred because the texts say they are, or the texts have them in them? I mean, I guess I'm thinking specifically in terms of the Bible, but
sacred, or you could say that some places are only sacred because people believe they're sacred for whatever reason. It might be text. There's no text in Australian Aboriginal culture.
But the story.
There's oral stories.
Yeah, no written text. They got cave paintings. That's a form of text.
Yes, and body paintings and cave paintings maybe. But actually, the ancient Greeks don't. Is there a place that's a sacred site? It's much more Homer's text, and then tragedy was the sacred site. It's the mythos. The mythos is the sacred site. There have been some modern Jewish scholars who've argued that Israel is basically the Jewish culture is based on the Bible. It's the word. The word is the sacred text. In the moment that Jews tried to make a real place, i.e. Israel, they were going against their tradition. But it was a sort of corruption, the violation of the sense that it's actually the word or the book that's the original, the primordial sacred site. Now this for Nietzsche is contrasted with Socratic knowledge, which just believes that's all mumbo jumbo, off with the fairies. And under the influence, Socrates gets replaced by history. Some of the main students of history, which attempts to get at the facts, the rational facts, what happened. Just to caricature the contrast seen through Nietzsche's eyes, the historian is interested in, say, what the mayor of Footscray had for breakfast in 1921 on the 3rd of September. That's a historical fact. Nietzsche's response from the standpoint of mythos is, who cares? That this is completely uninspired, uninteresting, trivial knowledge. Nietzsche's argument is actually under the influence of Socrates, this new conception of who we are, that we've ended up with the Mayor of Footscray. We start with the Trojan War or Jesus or wherever it happens to be, and we end up with rather profane facts. Let's unpack the argument, because that's really a caricature of it. Nietzsche's view of Socrates. Socrates has 3 axioms or 3 maxims. Nietzsche's Socrates. Probably true for Socrates we've read. What does Socrates stand for?
Everything that is beautiful is intelligible.
Nietzsche doesn't use the category of beautiful with Socrates. It's more the ethical, virtuous.
He does,
virtuous
but
knowledge.
In relation to the Apolline image and the artistic image, he perverts the Socratic maxim.
What's his line? Can you dig it up?
I can't remember exactly what page it's on, but I'll flip it down mindfully.
Sure. What is virtue is knowledge. What is good in an ethical sense is knowledge. This is familiar to us by now. Only the virtuous can be happy. Another one. We talked a bit about this a couple of weeks ago. So that being a good person brings happiness. And we sin only from ignorance. That's in terms of our discussion 2 weeks ago, the most controversial. We sin only from ignorance. Does Socrates, is that fair to Socrates? We sin only from ignorance. If we understand Socrates, if we understand the situation and what confronts us, we won't sin. We'll work our way through to the right course of action.
I mean, I think we kind of discussed it a little bit, that some people can see exactly the path that would be the virtuous one to take and choose the opposite.
And still can't follow it.
Yeah.
Like Hamlet thinks the right thing for me to do is kill my uncle, but I just can't do it. Which contradicts Socrates. Yeah, Nietzsche would say that Socrates basically is laughably optimistic and over-intellectual, over-rational, over-intellectual. That's just not what humans are like. It takes no account of Dionysian. It takes no account of the real structure of the human personality. Socrates' view.
So that's the sterilisation that comes from
That's the sterilisation. Too much Apollo. Yeah. And it's Apollo maybe in one of its most appealing senses, and it's the one that's. I mean, Nietzsche's argument. This is what's taken over the West. Socrates is one. We've actually largely followed Socrates.
Sorry, that quote.
Yep.
He parallels it as Euripides' reading of Socrates. So he says Euripides failed absolutely in his efforts to base tragedy solely upon the Apolline spirit, that is non-Dionysiac intention straight into inartistic naturalism. We may approach the phenomenon of aesthetic Socratism, the chief law of which is more or less to be beautiful, everything must first be intelligible. Parallel to the Socratic dictum, only the one who knows is virtuous.
Yeah, good. Yeah, okay. Good point. So he is linking aesthetics in there with ethics. What's the punchline of Nietzsche's argument about Socrates? We have this emphasis on doing good, on thinking about things, avoiding doing harm to others, but there's an assumption in Socratic thinking which has really been the devil in his influence. There's an assumption. Anyone should pick this up. This is very important to get straight. There's sort of the basic optimistic assumption that the West by and large has gone with. Well, he puts it in different ways. It's possible to perfect being. Possible to change ourselves. It's possible to change. I don't like who I am. I can change it. And Socrates, you can do this through thinking.
Is that through questioning everything?
And becoming a better person. Yes, yes. But the assumption underlying it is a very, very attractive, optimistic assumption. Is if I'm not happy, I don't like myself, I don't like aspects of myself, I can change it. I mean, the whole of modern psychotherapy and counselling is based on that assumption.
Yeah.
I mean, would that idea then be that, I mean, you can pursue that line of thought, but there is also, you're kind of neglecting the physiological element, the body essentially.
Yeah, Nietzsche would say you're neglecting a lot more than that. You're neglecting the actual nature of the human individual, which is the sort of Dionysus Apollo, the extremely potent and explosive relationship between those two. And you're producing false culture. If you follow Socrates, you produce false solutions. You actually won't do anyone any good. Nietzsche would say modern psychotherapy won't do you much good. I mean, it might be quite pleasant to sit down with someone an hour at a time who takes you seriously and listens to you and listens to you and listens to you. There's all sorts of sort of consolation, narcissistic consolation that can come in psychotherapy. But it's actually not addressing the real problem. The real problem is to do with Dionysus and Apollo. And only culture can solve. Only culture can address that.
I'm kind of reminded by this line by, these two images of these two competing forces. And he summed up that the force of literature should be to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comforted.
Who said that?
David Foster Wallace.
Could you say it again? Comfort the...
Literature should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comforted.
That's got nothing to do with Nietzsche.
No, I know, but I mean, metaphorically, kind of, like, I associate it with what we're talking about here. Because if you're too strong in one direction, say you take a Socratic method, you're sort of indulging that Greek cheerfulness that he talks about. But then the flip side of the thing is that, I mean, the Dionysiac individual will literally have no sense of self. And it isn't necessarily disturbed in their own sort of, way of involving themselves in that, but...
It sort of misses that line, I can see how you connect it. It misses the sense that culture is about providing stories, mythos, which make sense, that have some... that relate back to the Dionysian reality of the individual's life. And that you won't get a conjunction of Dionysus and Apollo unless the actual archetypes, the stories somehow pick up sort of the Dionysian realities, not rather than just papering them over or like the rational history, the Mayor of Footscray, it won't help you in times of crisis and personal tragedy. Whereas there is some sort of strong mythos element in the Anzac legend in this country. Otherwise, it wouldn't have the resonance that it does, and people go there. Coming into proximity to a powerful story from a while ago, where somehow the story is awakened in you, that actually may give a sort of calm and dignity to a life in a time of crisis. It may not, in which case it's not sort of mythos for you. But for Nietzsche, the intellectual history replaces myth, basically.
That's kind of what he defines as discussion on science, isn't it?
Yes.
That
history is one example.
Replaces mythos.
Yes. Yes. History is one example of. If your history is the Trojan War and Achilles, sort of it's mythic history, probably partly based on fact, partly not, or if your mythos is the life of Jesus and crucifixion, partly based on fact, you just don't know, then you're engaging in a sort of archetypal, archetypes, as we will with Magdalene next week, in a way that fact history just can't. Fact history is a rational exercise. Now we do get modern histories that have got strong mythic. Australian Gallipoli, C.W. Bean's journalist historical accounts, which gave birth to the myth. That's actually both fact history and mythos in one.
Yeah.
So, it's not true that we've completely gone towards the Mayor of Footscray's breakfast. There's still powerful history. Or powerful documentaries. Sort of powerful documentary. Many of you would have seen the recent film of Lincoln. Yes. Yeah, it's partly, or largely based on fact. So it's sort of fact history in that sense, but obviously mainly mythos. Creating a myth about that individual. So it would be an example of that. And its power, of course, depends on the mythos, doesn't it? Not on the facts.
I find that with every historical movie, you've got to take the grain of salt. You've got to go, well, this story did happen, that they've made it better translated to film than it would be. Like they change timelines, how long things take, and they make mistakes not happen, or they make mistakes do happen to make it better to watch.
Yeah, they've been dramatising the story.
Yeah,
you talk about Lincoln.
Both Lincoln and a lot of others, like you watch them and you read up, even just like you look at the Wikipedia page and go, and it lists the differences, and you're like, oh, they changed this and that, but
well, Homer doesn't describe Achilles going to the toilet.
No.
Lots of things. It's not real. Well, The Searchers is a great mythic or mythos film. And they're usually impervious to reason. You can say, well, that's a contradiction, or why did that happen, or why didn't you do that? But it's actually the mythos logic is a logic of its own that drives through, and it either works or it doesn't work.
Can't you say that most films are mythological in the sense that you're expected to suspend whatever reality you have? Like a lot of movies, you don't see people answering their cell phones or going to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Or...
And you'd be bored silly if you did.
Right.
Yeah, of course. Engaging story by definition it's got a mythos, the driving mythos component, which takes you out of your individual self, doesn't it? Back with Nietzsche. Yeah. Maybe it's an illusion, maybe. Well, what do you mean? The question for us there is, what do you mean by saying it's an illusion? Do you mean it's just not true, it's delusional, or is it's got this ambiguous truth to it?
Yeah, it's not a part of our reality. It's not the most physical reality. It's kind of somewhere in between. It's what we think is real, but really is not, because it doesn't include a whole bunch of stuff that is real.
But then why should that be a reality check? The fact that not all the facts are in there. So, life's millions and millions of facts, isn't it? We'd go mad if we tried to be conscious of all of them.
And that's in fact Nietzsche's point, isn't it? That the Apollo, too much focus on the Apollo, or the idea of truth and fact, is in fact the illusion, in as much as they're arbitrary, and what is really the reality is the nature of humanity or humans.
Yeah. It's a false rationality that following fact history, because it's selective in what it focuses on, it's selective in which events get included, of course. And he suggests that that's because psychologically it's trying to deny reality. It's not about telling the truth about the past. It's about living in denial of your Dionysian, the actual true nature of the human condition. And then Socrates, this is why Socrates is such a great corrupter. Well, Nietzsche would have had Socrates put to death for sure. For culture. Yeah, no, exactly.
Bless you.
And it's a modern, when Nietzsche would say, unredemptive illusion to think that the pursuit of truth in that sense So say take history, just to keep picking on history. And we could do it for philosophy, we could do it in lots of other areas of sociology. Sociology is full of this. Is the delusional thing that I've got control, I'm going to get insight into something that's important, it's going to help me change my life.
I think there's that impulse that the real nature, once you acknowledge that the nature of life is chaos, in the inner system we've been talking about, so many people have an impulse to run away from that, to try to get control, and that's where all of these different rationalities come from all these different famous sources.
Well, part of Nietzsche says it is chaos, but say Sophocles' Oedipus wouldn't say it's chaos, but say it's actually order, it's fated. Oedipus doesn't end up with a sense that life is chaos. He ends up with a sense that, oh, my life is terrible, but that's what it is, and it's got a form. It's not chaos. I mean, that's sort of, there are two Nietzsches going on here. That's why, at the end of the day, it makes this book so difficult. Partly, there's a sort of nihilistic Nietzsche that believes that there's nothing but the horror and the absurdity. Partly, there's the mythos Nietzsche, who believes that culture is based on fixed and sacred primordial sight. And they're actually quite different. As Nietzsche gets older, he swings more to the nihilistic view that there is just the horror and the absurdity.
It's kind of like the encapsulation of a existentialist argument where if there is nothing except, suffering and there's no purpose, then our culture becomes the only real meaning to life, because we've created that and that's the framework within which we live.
Yes, but if your presiding feeling is it's actually papering over an absurd and horrible reality, it's not going to work very well. So in a way, this Nietzsche, this ambivalence is us. That I think part of most modern people, if they're honest, fears that it's just horrible and absurd, to use these categories. Another part thinks, well, no, there's meaning and sense and order, and I've just got to find the way to making sense of my life. And that we sort of live, one of the many powers of this work, we sort of live with both those perspectives. Hamlet's lost the sense, the positive, that there is a positive. Hamlet's lost that. Ethan in The Searchers hasn't. Magdalene next week hasn't. You can very much look at her story through this lens. But once you get too much into this, it makes it difficult. If you think about some of the things you think about yourself, that, oh, I'm just kidding myself, it makes it difficult to live with that. If you're just kidding yourself, then, it's a bit undignified.
A large part of this book deals with music as well.
Yes, we haven't talked about that.
Strategic?
Well, it's sort of... Do you want to say any more?
Well, I mean, I guess the thing is that, if we consider these two deities, I suppose, the realm of appearance, the Apolline, and the realm of, primordial energy, the Dionysiac, you can't, as an individual, really sustain a Dionysiac lifestyle, for lack of a better word. It has no appearance. And I think that's the sort of justification that Nietzsche uses for music. It doesn't have an appearance per se, but it is an effective thing. Whereas art in the Apolline context really is the only way to sustain what the representation of the Dionysiac could possibly be. And that's the way in which the Dionysiac gets sustained.
Being lost in music. So you would live your life. Oh, okay.
Saying a bit the opposite. Anyone else?
Didn't Nietzsche say that without life without music makes no sense? So it must be.
And it's the essence of the Darwinism, and it's true, and we haven't really.
And is he? I'm wondering whether Nietzsche's using art and music as a way to, like how he's arguing against the Socratic thinking, and how you're saying before how that it's almost trying to whitewash a little bit and cover up some of the Dionysus in life. So isn't he, I don't know, is he saying that art and music is something there that is a mirror of society and can reflect, and that helps keep a balance with the Socratic thinking?
I mean, I think in part he's trying to separate music off from the other art forms.
Well,
And the wild Dionysian Bacchanalian sort of image is linked with music.
Especially German music.
Well, that's, yeah, I suggest you don't read the two Wagner.
It just made me think that he'd be very disappointed with the state of music now. especially because, you know, most popular music, at least, is written and collaborated and like sung and produced by 12 different people, and so it's not going to be like one person's basically heart and soul, like he kind of describes it as.
I mean, Apollo's taken over music.
Yeah.
and
But
Apollo's
some-
killed music.
Some popular music causes great ecstasy. That song of Gautier, someone I used to know,
Right.
it drove the world crazy.
Well, I'm not saying people's
Right.
response to it isn't like one of these things or the other, but like the actual creation of it isn't as
Yeah,
pure
sure.
as
The effect of it
right.
was huge.
Mhm.
And there are plenty of examples
I guess there's always been a history of influence in music too, that, you know, someone comes up, writes their original tune, but really they've had whatever influences that they've brought from other people, and that maybe,
That's inevitable.
yeah. I know it's kind of mass produced now, but
It's a very specific type of music that he's talking about in this as well. Like, I mean, pop music, what's that? Look at, I don't know, Justin Bieber. It's just, I mean, it's sort of like, you know, surface, you know.
Yeah.
It is an appearance, you know, it doesn't really deal with
What
feelings.
about punk?
Yeah.
What about punk music? How would Nietzsche regard punk music?
Oh, it's
I reckon he's
he
like it.
describes
Wouldn't he
the.
like
I think you're right. It has a little bit more
Yeah.
like personality in it.
Talks about lyrical poets. I remember reading
Yeah.
about lyrical poets. So I think, you know, I think he would like punk, some of the content and the
It's not
lyrics.
just bad Dionysus.
I'm more inclined.
Supreme intensity.
Yeah.
Or if he didn't like it per se, he'd at least know, like, you know, appreciate and go,
yeah.
you know, well, I understand, you know, these guys have passion, that this is what they live for, you know, it's, and that you know,
It simplifies it.
yeah.
Sort of powerful music is a synthesis of Dionysus and Apollo, isn't it? There's always an organised rhythm, order, controlling. Otherwise, it, you know, just be a mess. Like all that punk, which is probably not a mess. Just months reading. I don't know if you know Bach. Bach's masses and cantatas. I mean, he's a real case of incredibly powerful Dionysian Bacchanalian energy in the music, but also really strong intellectual rigour, controlling, and it's a sort of really the vibrating fusion of the two. And in some ways, it's almost an ideal example for Nietzsche. Nietzsche would have known his work well. But you can find popular music equivalents. But there's something different about music, isn't there? It's sort of, in a way, if Nietzsche's talking about the primal oneness of existence, there's something about tunes, or a certain tune really strikes you, takes you out of yourself, and somehow connects you with something timeless.
It's if the music is accomplishing what it wants to, which is to I suppose connect with you. Like, so I think to the previous example, when music tells a story and you relate to that, you are feeling that sense of oneness with the. You realise then that there is a communal feeling. There are other people out there that feel like you. So I think it can accomplish that through relatedness.
But with respect to what Nietzsche is talking about, music doesn't do that. It requires, either music requires the stage or vice versa. One does not exist without the other.
So you mean the stage then gives it a story form,
yeah.
Whereas the music is abstract?
I mean, it attends to that part of it, for sure. But then this is where Socrates comes back into it, and he mentions Euripides. He said that what Euripides does is transfigures what the story does, as opposed to telling a story, it communicates knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So music that moves you, and let's say it's got no words or it's got no specific story, is that just consoling, or is that more than, is it connecting you with
a story without words?
And are you supplying the story?
Most of the time, as an individual, you supply your own personal experiences to fill the void of the lack of words, but the rises and falls in the tone and everything like that, that kind of explains where it's going. So like epic music, it's like trying to for an opera sense, like if it's like large clangs and big drums and stuff like that, like Wagner, that doesn't require the words because the epicness of the music experience, like, I don't know how to explain it, and I'm just getting tongue-tied.
Well, it's difficult to talk about music. I think it's
because it does take you out of the rational, out of your, you know, it
does.
It puts you into a different language almost, doesn't it?
I must admit, I thought of like techno music, not that I'm into it, but when they talk about individuals submerging their identities in the mass and this primal oneness, and I just got this image of everyone in a mosh pit, just, you know, dancing like one entity.
Dionysian, primitive Dionysian music. Yeah, that's perfect. Nietzsche, primitive Dionysian, which we can all, you mentioned that, or, you know, screaming Beatles fans.
Yeah.
I think definitely each person brings their own experiences and stories to a specific piece of non-lyrical music. Like, I mean, I could say that, like...
Isn't it just a tune? Sometimes it's just a tune that somehow appeals to you and you don't know why. You don't even actually associate it with the story.
Yeah.
Well, there is, on page 76, Nietzsche says this tremendous opposition, this yawning abyss between the alkaline plastic arts and Dionysiac music became so obvious to one of our great thinkers that even without the guidance of the divine Hellenic symbols, he said that music differed in character and origin from all the other arts, because unlike them, it was not a replica of phenomena, but the direct replica of the will itself, and complemented everything physical in the world with representation of the thing itself, the metaphysical.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the sort of difference that he's trying to get at.
Yeah, that's
in his discussion.
And whereas tragedy is a much more rationalised, music is this primitive, comes out of the Dionysian, unreconstructed. Then a Bach or whoever else it is reconstructs the music. So they put a story on it and you get this tension going between the two.
I find with a lot of classical music though, it's been used a lot in movies and television adverts and various other. I'll associate it with particularly a scene like Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries from Apocalypse Now. And every time I hear the song, it's in a lot of recent video games on the radio station. I hear it and it brings back that scene, no matter and because a lot of
it's supplied a story. Apocalypse Now supplied a story for you, surfing and whatever else.
But before that, like that's learned experiences that we have now. Whereas I think like with the metaphysical is the real point. I think this is kind of his most powerful counterexample to the Socratic argument where there's something in nature that exists that is devoid of reason, but it still communicates with us before a story. And like I think of things like classical music where for some reason strings make us all feel suspense. And we've learnt that now, but the first time we've heard that music, we were feeling it anyway, without having needed to learn it. Or, certain brass flurries, make us feel triumphant and things like that. And that just comes out of, where does that come from?
There's a line here, I don't know if this is, it's the desire to express the very essence of nature symbolically. And and it's simple in terms of physical features, and one of them is music, and he's talking about dynamics, harmony, assert themselves with great energy. So maybe expressing nature, and we use music and battling classical music to express that, and that was symbolically, but also in a physical way as well, through sound.
I mean, it's just
great
like
great poetry, like really, and Agamemnon are musical in their own way, but they're actually telling us that we're going into a different world, aren't we? Because they're taking on a particular story of tragedy, of suffering, of human story, which then we identify with various actors in the story, and the story then works on us in a different way the music works on us. And usually the music is just supportive at that point, as in the Searchers, there's a lot of background music right away at the end, but it's really supportive of the story, the archetypal story, which is the principal cultural form
here. But music in cinema is used to great effect also, to either enhance the drama, the scene. The background music is very carefully chosen to produce an effect on what you're seeing.
Yes.
Yeah, all those movies that we've been talking about wouldn't be the same experience without their sound.
Well, Apocalypse Now is a bit like an opera, and it's a bit of a message story. We're going to read Heart of Darkness, which is it's a copy of, or actually a pretty poor copy, you realise. Read Heart of Darkness carefully.
And music, like changes how things happen in real life. You know, with in the movie Kelly's Heroes, which I don't understand, it's a World War II set documentary where they go and rob a German bank. They're attacking a German base, and one of the tanks has a big speaker on it, and they're playing all these happy songs as they're attacking this base. It just obviously in the soldiers, same as it with the Robin Williams one. Yeah, when I don't care what you play, but play it loud. Music, especially in wartime, it can change how someone's feeling. It can make you feel better about yourself, and yeah.
What about, just back with rational history, families? What you're taught about your parents and your grandparents and your people are often after their family trees today, which is usually rationally going through who came before who. Now, to what degree do we grow up with a sort of mythos sense of our individual past in terms of specific ancestors, or to what degree is that lost? Or is that not the place that mythos comes? The Jesus story is very, very heavy on the fact that your actual genealogy, your parents and your grandparents were, is actually not important. If you're interested in mythos, that's not important. Mythos lies elsewhere. There's actually this debate very strongly in the Jesus story. We'll come to a little bit of that. What do you think about?
It's interesting you bring that up, because in relation to what's on the board behind you, fixed and sacred primordial site, you might have no idea where you've come from, but as soon as you click onto that, there is this kind of effect that sort of, I guess in just a very sort of...
Once you click onto genealogy, you start seeing...
Yeah, and say, oh, look, my grandma was from, the Prussian state, and then, do a bit of research and you pick up on some psychology of that, and then it's like, well, I must have some of that in me. And you sort of start to replicate a kind of psychology through this primordial site.
Ethnicity and identity, you then identify with something else and perhaps change yourself now and the way you behave to identify with.
Is this mythos or Socrates?
I think there's mythos in there.
I'd like to spend a little bit of that. My mum is horrible. She's all over the ancient tree and finding where we all come from. And it's really fascinating because it does, even the bits that you don't know, you kind of want to know more. And eventually she's actually discovered that however many lines back, family of mine were bricklayers. And at this stage, family of mine are bricklayers. And so I guess that sort of, that level of connection or myth, or if you want to go fate, it just keeps showing itself up. So like we had bricklayers, we had carpenters, and at the moment I have two uncles, one of them is a bricklayer and one of them is a carpet layer.
But wouldn't the devil's advocate just say, well, you've got a bricklayer gene in the family which keeps popping up every 3 generations, which is not very mythos.
But like, what of that is...
Well, that would be the scientific view would be that you've got a bricklayer gene.
But like, what would a bricklayer gene look like? Like,
who cares? It just does keep popping up every 3 generations.
But it could just be like when you read a horoscope though, and you pick out the bits that are relevant and meaningful to you, and you go, oh wow, it said this and that did happen, but the 90% that didn't happen, you sort of forget.
And like I take on the horoscope thing, like it's you take it with a grain of salt. You're like that, you know, you basically as a teenage girl, you're feeling a sense of doubt. Well, yes, she's a teenage girl. You know, it's like you know, you just make guesses on what a person looks like, and you can.
Cold ready.
Yeah. Well, horoscopes are faked, aren't they? The assumption is this is fated, and it's in the stars or whatever. And this is a bit hankering after. There's a larger story than just I was born to those parents. There's in the background there. There's a thing pointing bricklaying tendency, or there's a ballet tendency, or whatever it might happen to be. And that's part of what's going on there, I think, is a groping for a bigger story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the who, like making sense of who we are.
Yeah. Through a bigger story. Because the particular story of me getting up in the morning, this Monday morning, and coming through a bad road of Sociology of Culture, I need something bigger than that.
It's a searching for
a mythos.
Particular a community.
Well,
to become one with.
Community might be the mythos. The community might be important in the mythos. It may. We'll look at Magdalene next week. She's not a case where the community is important, whereas the family of bricklayers, generations of bricklayers, is a community. I mean, you're right. I think the community may be a part of the mythos. Or you're yearning for a mythic community, which is more than just my boring brothers and sisters and 2 parents. Something grander. So that it just not be the horror and the absurdity. Now Nietzsche will come back and say, well, that's just all the nihilistic Nietzsche will say it's just redemptive illusion, you're kidding yourselves. The other Nietzsche will say, well, you might actually find something substantive. And I suspect we've got both of those.
Like a tribal connection. We're searching for the